Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you here. So for folks listening right now, if you haven't met Jonah yet, Jonah Berger is a marketing professor at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's the best-selling author of Contagious, Why Things Catch On, and Invisible Influence, the Hidden Forces That Shape Behavior. So Jonah, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get started in marketing, and then why did you decide to write a book?
Yeah, so I've spent the last 15, almost 20 years now doing academic research. My undergraduate degree was in human judgment and decision making. I did a PhD in marketing, and that's how I ended up being an academic. I always found questions of human behavior to be quite interesting. I always wondered kind of why people do what they do, and this is a great job to be able to study those sorts of things. And in terms of a book, I had always been interested in why things catch on, word of mouth and how it works. Had started doing some research in sort of the early 2000s on what makes online content viral, looking at why certain newspaper articles, for example, make the most emailed list. And I had always felt like there was room for a very academic book in the space. There's a lot of sort of popular press perspectives on word of mouth, but none of it was really backed up by data. Like many people, I read The Tipping Point a number of years ago, thought it was a great book, but unfortunately, not all the opinion in that book is actually based on science. About half of it's sort of wrong at this point, and we've also learned a lot since that book came out. And so I thought, wouldn't it be neat to pull all the academic literature together, but put it in a way that people could understand? I took a course at Wharton for a while called Contagious, How Products, Ideas, and Behaviors Catch On. And people would always ask, I couldn't take the course, but could you give me the syllabus or could you give me materials from it? And there wasn't really a handy way to kind of give them what was covered in the class. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be neat to pull that all together? And that was my first book.
That's great. So how did you go about the process of actually getting the book published?
I decided that I would write a proposal. Well, so first I decided I would talk to some people about what writing a book was like. Went around, talked to some different authors who were out there, folks that I knew in the space, academics who had done popular press sorts of things. And from them, I found an agent. And after I got the agent, I said, I'll write a proposal. And if that goes well enough, I'll try to sell a book. And so sort of, went back and forth on the proposal stage, worked on something, ended up pulling it together. We shopped it around and it did well enough that I decided it was worth continuing down the process.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And how long did that process take from kind of the idea of I'm going to write a book until the time it actually got published and released and you saw it on bookshelves?
Oh, wow. I mean, the book writing process takes a long time for a number of reasons. First of all, even when you're done with the book, at least for my experience, it takes, 8 months to a year for that book to actually come out. But from when you're actually done with it, it often takes months, if not years of setup time. And so probably end to end process on the first book probably took, maybe 3, 4 years, something along those lines. Writing itself, the really focused writing part took something like 6 to 8 months, but there was a lot of back and forth with editing and so on that lengthened the process.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And if you had to go back and kind of do it again as a brand new author, is there anything you would have done differently?
That's an interesting question. I think from interacting with a few authors here and there, and thinking about book writing more as a science than an art, and the art of trying to sell a book as well as just write a book, I think it's really important to have a good sense of your audience and a good sense of why you're writing the book. And I think the books that do better really hit on both of those notes. They're not just writing a book. They have a really good sense of, well, who would buy this book and why would they buy this book? Just like sort of traditional marketing where you think about a target segment that you position your offering towards, what is your book positioned towards? Who are the people that are going to buy this? Have you talked to those people or interacted with them enough to actually find out if they want it? I didn't do this myself, but I've heard other authors that do, where they almost like a stand-up comedian, before a stand-up comedian films a special, they try out material. They see what works and what doesn't work, and then they pull the book together out of that. And so I think, that's another interesting way to think about it, where rather than doing speaking after the book writing, for example, you say, well, maybe I'll do speaking to help me figure out what that book exactly is, what pieces should be in that book, what parts are working versus not working. It's just like a comedian with a joke. The more times you tell it, the more you figure out the right structure and and the right different sorts of pieces that help it be successful.
Definitely. That's really good advice. So in your book, Contagious, I mean, you talk a lot about obviously word of mouth, right? And how word of mouth drives sales and how to get things to catch on, right? And still to this day, I mean, even with the internet, even with everything that's changed in the publishing business, word of mouth is still the number one reason people buy books by far. So what are some things that authors can do to actually get their book and make it more contagious, to make it more likely to catch on and get more word of mouth sales?
Yeah, so in our research, we found that sort of 6 key factors, I put them in an acronym in Contagious called the STEPS, which stands for social currency, triggers, emotion, public, practical value, and stories. Those 6 things drive most word of mouth, most if not all of why products and ideas catch on. And as authors, I think we really need to see our customers, which are readers in this case, how we can turn them into advocates, how we can in some sense make them a channel for our message. You don't need to have a big advertising to do it. Most authors don't have a big advertising budget, a big publisher behind them pushing their book. But the question is, well, who is this target segment that might be interested in the book? And how can you create a situation where one of them is going to tell someone else? So take social currency, for example. The main idea there is the better something makes you look, the more like you are to talk about it or share it. The better something reflects on you, the more like you are to pass it on. Okay, great. So how can we make our readers look smart, special, and in the know by sharing our content? If we're nonfiction, for example, what are the sound bites, the factoids, the piece of information that are going to make that person look smart at a cocktail party or clever among their friends? If it's a fiction book, what are the snippets that are going to make someone look really interesting and knowledgeable and well-read if they pass them on? And so, not just thinking about, well, what is my book, but kind of what might be that thing that the people who read the book might want to share about it. And, I think a big challenge today is a lot of authors think it's all about social media. We think word of mouth, so it's all about social media. I got to have a Twitter presence and a Facebook presence, and I got to build my audience. And social media can certainly be a useful channel and a useful way to build an audience. But what I think people often forget is that social media is not the only channel through which word of mouth flows. If you actually look at the data, and you say what percent of word of mouth is online, on blogs, on social media, on online reviews, you might think it's huge. You might think it's 70% or 60% or 50%. Only about 7 to 10% of all word of mouth is online. Most of it is actually offline. Most of it is face-to-face. And so while social media is certainly valuable, it's certainly a way to get your message out there, you need to think less about the technology and more about the psychology. Why might someone talk about or share my book? What content can I put out there, whether online or off, to encourage them to do that? And how can I turn them into a vehicle for my message?
Gotcha. That's great advice. So what is like an actionable step someone could do like during the writing process of the book to kind of add that social trigger in? Like, should they add stories or facts or interesting things that are maybe they wouldn't have put that in the book originally, but just because they want to add something that's really unique and interesting about the book, should they add that extra thing in?
Yeah, I mean, so take triggers, for example. So we talked about social currency. That's about what you share and how it makes you look to pass it on. Triggers is the idea that if something is top of mind, it's more likely to be tip of tongue. The more you're thinking about something, the more likely you are to talk about it. So we don't only talk about things that make us look good. We talk about things even if they're boring because we're trying to fill conversational space. Why do people talk so much about the weather, for example? It's not the most exciting thing out there, but it's something that's top of mind, and so they share it. And so thinking about, well, what are the hooks in your book that link to things that are going on in popular culture, or link to things that are time of year specific or are event specific, so that when those things come up, people might remember your book, the content in your book, and cause them to want to talk about it or share it. Kit Kat did a fun example of this that I talk about in Contagious, the candy bar Kit Kat, where they link themselves to coffee. So sales are down. People liked Kit Kat, but they weren't buying it. They linked themselves to coffee. They said, having a coffee break, have a Kit Kat. Think about coffee, think about Kit Kat. Coffee and Kit Kat and coffee, best friends forever. And if you're Kit Kat, coffee is a really good trigger, a really good thing to link yourself to because people drink it a lot. And what happened is when people went to go get coffee from local convenience stores, they would remember that link to Kit Kats and they'd be more likely to buy them. And so, I often talk about if someone said peanut butter and, well, what word would come to mind? And most people would say, well, jelly. Or if, you said rum and, people would say, well, Coke. And if you think about one of these things reminds people of the other, even if it's not there, even if jelly's not around, if you see peanut butter, it makes you think of jelly. And that's what's called a trigger. That's a thing in the environment that triggers or cues people to think about a related product or idea or stimulus, even if it's not there. And so the same thing is quite important in books. What is that peanut butter for your book, for your idea? What's that thing or things in the environment that can remind someone to talk about you? Is it they're at a cocktail party and there's a topic that often gets brought up and that gives them an opportunity to trot out the story from your book? It's not just whether someone likes it when they read it, but even after they read it, are they going to remember it and continue to talk about it? And part of that is if the environment reminds them to do it. We all have great stories. We need an excuse to tell those stories. And that's what triggers are. They're little environmental excuses to bring up something, even if that thing isn't there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. It's really good insight for sure. It kind of reminds me of the book, The Hunger Games. So at the end of the first book, Katniss and Peter, I think they won, and she's about to, and they have to just be one victor, right? And so she's about to kill herself with some poison berries, and that just reminded me of Shakespeare, right? Romeo and Juliet. And so creating that kind of, it's like an allusion to that, like that connection in my mind that's created, has created this social triggers where I talk about that book more because of that one scene, that one idea that links to kind of this, archetype of great literature, which is Shakespeare.
Definitely. And I think, as you think about what to link yourself to, the more frequent those things come up, the more effective it's likely to be. So, a few years ago now, Budweiser had that famous "What's Up" campaign where everybody said, "What's up? What's up? What's up?" And you may not like that campaign, you may like it, but at the time, if someone said "What's up" to you, you couldn't help but think about that campaign. Every time someone said it, it reminded you of that campaign. The recent example of that is Geico's ad for Hump Day. So, Geico has this piece of content where there's a camel walking around an office going, "What day is it? What day is it?" And finally he says, "It's Hump Day," and everyone gets very excited. And great piece of content is sort of funny, not amazingly funny, but it does very well every Wednesday, which is Hump Day. And so, if you're picking something, you don't want to link yourself to a holiday or something that's infrequent. You want to link yourself to something that's more frequent. If you're a summer read, for example, can you link yourself to the beach or something else that people are likely to be doing around that time? To me, my favorite example of triggers is reusable grocery bags. I don't know about you or your listeners, but most people have them in the house, but most of us forget to take them to the grocery store. We mean to take them to the store, but we can't remember when we go to the store. And when we remember is basically when we get to the checkout line, which is too late, right? We get to the checkout line, we think, "Oh, I should have brought my bags," but it's too late to go back home to get it. And so there's a peanut butter there, but it's kind of in the wrong place. And so when I work with clients, what I suggest to them about triggers is to think about 4 key things. First, who do you want to be triggered? Again, who is that target market, that segment that you're going after? Then, when do you want them to think about you? When is that right time near where they need to take action? If I'm a summer read, it's the summer. If it's a gifting book, are people going to think about it around the holidays? Then what is around that time and how can you create a link to that thing? Those 4 key questions, the who, the when, the what, and the how, really think about, well, what trigger should I build into the book so it comes to mind at the right time?
Mm-hmm. That's great. So what about emotion? How can we add more of an emotional component to our books to make them go more viral?
Yeah, so we did a bunch of work around emotion, and the research we did around emotion really comes out of looking at the New York Times most emailed list and a bunch of other lists of online content. And I think we all have this intuition that, negative spreads. If it bleeds, it leads, for example, people talk about in the news business, or, in the hotel business, people talk about how a satisfied customer tells 3 people and a dissatisfied one tells 3,000. And so you might think that negative emotion is what spreads. And so we looked at a bunch of data. We looked at thousands of New York Times articles written across all different sections of the paper to look at which articles made the most emailed list and why. What were the features of those articles that were correlated with making the list? And first, we found that emotion mattered. The more emotional articles were more likely to be shared. More emotions seemed to be good. But it wasn't that all emotions were equal. We actually found first that positive emotions were shared more than negative emotions. And that might be a little bit surprising in that you think, well, hold on, if it bleeds, it leads. Isn't that all about negative emotion? But we have to remember, similar to what we talked about when we discussed social currency, is that what we share is a reflection of ourselves. And so while we might like reading, for example, or like clicking on really anger-inducing articles or really sad articles or really negative articles, we don't necessarily want to share those with everyone else all the time because we know it might not make us look very good. Everyone wants to be friends with a positive Polly rather than a negative Nelly. And so while we read or engage with content that's negative, positive stuff is actually shared more than negative stuff. And we also looked at specific emotions. So if you think about different negative emotions, for example, like anger versus sadness, both of those are negative. Neither of them feel good, but there's an important difference between what you want to do when you're angry and what you want to do when you're sad. We looked at the data, for example. We found that sad articles, the more sad a piece of content makes people, the less likely they are to share it. But the more angry or anxious content makes people, the more likely they are to share it. And all those are negative emotions, so it can't be that negative decreases all sharing. Sometimes it increases. So what's different between anger and sadness? And when you think about it, well, what do you want to do when you're angry? You want to yell at someone. You want to throw something. You want to take an action. You want to do something to change your state. What do you want to do when you're sad? Well, not very much. Right? You want to sort of curl up in a ball and do nothing, right? Watch your favorite movie or put on your favorite sweatshirt. And it turns out that sadness is all about inaction, whereas anger is about action. And all of these activating emotions, high arousal emotions, what they're called, on the negative side, things like anger or anxiety and surprise, but also things on the positive side, like excitement, like humor, like inspiration. All these high arousal emotions are shared, whereas low arousal emotions like sadness or contentment aren't shared. And so it's not just about positive or negative, it's about, are these emotions activating? Are they firing people up to take action? And I think it's particularly neat to think about these results when you think about the recent election, right? Whether you like Trump or not, he's done a very good job of playing on anger and anxiety. He's used anger and anxiety to get people to share his message and make his content viral online. You go back a couple of elections, you think about Obama when he first came out, he really ran on inspiration. And you might think that, well, inspiration and anger and anxiety are completely different things. They are a little different. One's negative and the other is positive, but they're quite similar in that they're both high arousal emotions. They both fire us up to take action. They both drove people to share in both cases. And so as authors, I think we need to think not only about emotion, right? Are our stories emotional? Are they touching people's lives? But what emotions are they evoking? We may have a very sad story that people remember, but they're not really going to want to tell other people. Whereas if there's a story they read that makes them angry or anxious, or there's a story they read that makes them excited or makes them laugh, they're much more likely to turn to their friend and pass that information on.
That's really good insight. So it sounds to me then like, especially if someone's writing a novel, they should really take those emotions into account and say, what emotions do I want to elicit in the reader? Because like you're saying, if you elicit all these sad emotions, a very sad book, it's unlikely that someone's going to share it as they would with a book that made them angry or excited or inspired.
Certainly. And I think I've done some work with the New York Times since the paper came out. And I think there's always a challenge as a content creator, whether you're the New York Times or whether you're an author. I think of those folks as content creators, but sort of thinking, well, do I design the content for virality, or do I design the content based on what I want to write about or what I want to talk about? And I think that you can't go too far in either direction. If you only think about, what's going to make people share this, you might end up with a story that's highly shareable, but not very interesting, and you might not want to write it. On the other hand, if you only think about, well, do I enjoy writing this story, or is it a good story, but you don't think at all about, well, whether people will share that story, it's going to be less likely that that story catches on. You're going to have to engage in a more uphill battle to get people to pass along that content. And so to me, I think a good analogy is thinking about healthy food, but cooking it the right way. So if you think about it, for example, and I asked which is tastier, Brussels sprouts or a cheeseburger, everyone would say, well, cheeseburger is much tastier, right? It just fits better with the way our tongues and our stomachs are designed. We know we should eat more Brussels sprouts, but we love the cheeseburger because it just fits with us. And the same thing is true with sharing. The same thing is true with content. Certain content fits better with us based on the way that we're designed. But that doesn't mean that we have to give up if we've got Brussels sprouts. You can take Brussels sprouts and you can cook it in a way that makes it more tasty. It makes it more engaging based on understanding why people share things, or in that case, why people like choosing food. If you steam Brussels sprouts, they're terrible, but if you roast them with a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of salt, they're much more delicious. And so as content creators, I think we need to take our really good content and engineer it along the edges, cook it along the edges to make it tastier. We're doing a big project right now, for example, looking at online content and what affects whether people read content or not. Not just whether they click on it, but do they keep reading it? So do you only read the headline and opt out, or do you keep going? And what about certain online articles really encourage greater reading depth? And the notion there is, well, not only, can we make bad things catch on, but by understanding this, can we get good, important stuff that's difficult to pay attention to get people to pay more attention?
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense, right? So it's you have to find something you're passionate about, something you're actually going to follow through with, but you also have to find a way to make it viral. And so finding that balance, that mix between like the art and the science, like you said before, I think is really crucial to long-term success.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So we've only got a couple minutes left, but I know step 6 is all about stories, right? And of course, as authors, as writers, that's what we do all day is share and tell stories. So what are some other things that we can do to kind of make a story more likely to be shared and more likely to kind of share our ideas or our books along with it?
There's great research out there on stories, what makes an engaging story, how to tell a better story. I actually have a book on my desk in front of me at the moment called The 7 Basic Plots, which is all about different plots and storytelling that reading for a project we're doing on movies. I only have one piece of information to add to the great work already that's out there on stories, which is that a good story is good, but it's only good for the story creator if it carries the creator along for the ride. And if we think about Trojan horse stories, the Trojan horse, the Greeks, the Trojans, no one can win, so they build a big wooden horse, they hide their men inside. Good stories are like that. They carry things along for the ride. If you think about The Boy Who Cried Wolf, for example, that old famous parable, it's not just an interesting story. If you listen to it, you want to find out what happens to the boy, but it carries a message along with it. Don't lie. Lying is a bad idea. And if you think about it, lots of stories carry things along for the ride. They carry insights, they carry take-home messages, they carry points, they can carry brands and other things along with them. And so as an author, it's not just about telling a really good story, because if you tell a really good story, but no one can remember where they heard it, it's not going to help you at the end of the day. You've made something that's viral, but not necessarily valuable. And so we need to do what's called valuable virality. We need to create these stories that carry us, the storytellers, along with them. What's a really good story that when someone remembers that story, they can't forget the take-home message or the author that told it to them? You think about The Power of Habit, a book that came out by Charles Duhigg a few years ago. Great book. Almost everybody who talked about that book talked about one story, which is a story about Target figuring out someone was pregnant before their parents even knew they were pregnant, based on the things they were buying online. And that was not just a great story, it was a story of the power of big data to pull out insights. That was sort of the kernel that it carried along with it, and that brought along the message of the book. And so thinking about stories, don't just think what makes a good story, but what will carry you, the storyteller, along with it.
Definitely. That's great advice for sure. Well, thank you so much, Jonah, for sharing so much great information with us today. Where can folks find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so best place to find me is my website, which is just Jonah, Jonah, Berger, BERGER.com. There's a bunch of free resources there. There's a guide to apply the steps from Contagious. There's some other work about being more influential, making better decisions. And the books are available, whatever books are sold, Contagious and Invisible Influence. And then also on Twitter at J1Berger. If you have any questions, your listeners have any questions, more than happy to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonah. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.